Well, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, whatever. Okay, good afternoon. First of all, I do bring you greetings from LMU. I came to LMU in 1987, so I've been there a long, long time, but certainly long enough to know that Pepperdine has traditionally been one of our arch rivals in basketball and other things. Not to our advantage lately, mind you, but you know how it goes. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and just a couple words by way of introduction. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my father came from a Jewish household, and my mother came from a Roman Catholic household, and apparently when you mix these two, you get a Presbyterian. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but that's the way it is. I have a great uncle who died a few years ago, who was an Orthodox rabbi, a great aunt who was a mother superior, and so it makes sense that I'm a Presbyterian minister who teaches about early Judaism and Christianity at a Catholic university. It all just kind of blends together. Everybody has a copy of the two-sided one-page handout, yes? More or less? I know you're going to treasure this always. And let's just dig right in. The Gospel of John poses a particular problem for Christians, because here in this very deep theological gospel, you have a rather astonishing statement made by Jesus about the Jews. And I didn't presume that you would bring your Bibles, so what you have here is this passage from chapter 8, verse 44. And it's all this debate about whose father they have. And so the Jews say to Jesus that Abraham is our father, and Jesus says, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did, but now you're trying to kill me. Someone who has told you the truth that I heard from God, that's not what Abraham did. You're doing what your father does. And they said, hey, we're not illegitimate children. We have one father, God himself. And Jesus says, if God were your father, you would love me. For I came from God, and now I'm here. I didn't come on my own. He sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It's because you cannot accept my word. And here comes the kicker. You are from your father, the devil. And you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. So most people would agree that this is probably the single most anti-Jewish statement in the New Testament. The Jews are children of the devil. And you can just imagine the kind of mischief this passage has played over the centuries, especially in Christian-Jewish relations. And it has justified some horrendous Christian persecution of the Jews over the centuries. And so one of the questions is, all right, now we live in a post-Holocaust age. What do we do with a passage like this? And what I'm going to suggest is something that scholars have been suggesting for a good generation, namely, what we need to do is to contextualize the Gospel of John and understand the Gospel of John within its original settings. And what we're going to see is that the Gospel of John represents in many ways a kind of sibling rivalry between two competing groups of people who have a Jewish identity in one way or another. And what do you know about siblings? They know how to fight like nobody knows how to fight. They know where the buttons are. They know how to push them. Now, it's not just that it's sibling rivalry here, but it's also going to be the case that these rival groups are each going to lay claim to being the true interpreters of the Jewish tradition, the true heirs of the Jewish tradition. And so there's this vilifying that takes place that is actually fairly typical of literature in the first century between competing Jewish groups, and it happens beyond that as well. But we're going to focus upon the early Christian and Jewish components here. And so, reading in context. So we're on all the way down to number 2. One of the things I like to say is that the Gospels, it's helpful to look at them in a couple of different ways. And let me see if I can, I asked if we could draw something here, so let's see how this goes. I'm drawing right now. You can't tell what I'm drawing. It looks a lot like a presidential debate, doesn't it? Yeah, we'll do this. Okay. This is the most scintillating part of the lecture, right here. Okay? And if you can read it, good for you. So, can you see that? More or less?
Yeah.
Believe it or not, that says gospel with an arrow down, window, Jesus, and kind of a tooth-thingy arrow saying mirror. Typically, what everybody does is to use the gospel as a window onto the world of Jesus. And it's a very straightforward reading. The gospel says this is what Jesus did, this is what Jesus said. Fair enough. But it's also very important to realize, and as you know, each of the Gospels is writing from a particular perspective, from a particular vantage, from a particular experience. And this experience gets reflected in how they tell the story. And if you imagine yourself walking by a department store window, for example, you can look through the window and see the thing that's in there, but depending upon where you're standing, how you're looking, you can often also see your reflection in the window. And so I like to think of the Gospels as a combination of a window onto the world of Jesus, but it's also a mirror that reflects what's going on in the lifetime of the Gospel writer. So we're also getting that image, and they get fused, they get mixed together. Now, of course, we tend to be most interested in what was going on in the life of Jesus. But for our purposes today, I'm more interested in what's going on within the lifetime of the community that surrounds John's Gospel, because he's writing for a particular group of people. And so that's what we're going to be paying attention to. And this works, by the way, with all of the Gospels. You can see them as windows onto the world of Jesus. You can ask, all right, well, what is going on in the life of the author that reflects their concerns? The Gospel of Luke, for example, is very interested in the mission to the Gentiles. And you can see how that gets worked into the Gospel story as he tells that story. John is very interested in this battle with the synagogue, this fight between what we might call Christian Judaism or Jewish Christianity and non-Christian Judaism. And so the irony in John is that John is both perhaps the most Jewish of all the Gospels, even more so than Matthew, and it's the most anti-Jewish of all of the Gospels. So let's figure that out. So the first thing to say after being aware of this kind of relationship is that the Gospel of John is just immersed with Jewish imagery. And John presumes that you know this imagery. And so it doesn't get spelled out. The presumption is you understand the allusions, the references. So that, and I've just listed a few of them here. So for example, John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. What does that sound like? Well, it kind of sounds like the beginning of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And indeed it is. This is a new creation story. And what John is doing is taking the original creation story and now reading it in light of faith in Jesus, and this very high view of Jesus as the incarnate Word of God, but using the Jewish scriptures to do that. Or Jacob's ladder. This is John 1:51, where Jesus says, "You will see angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Now, if you don't know the story of Jacob's ladder, it's not going to make a lot of sense to you. John presumes you do know the story, where Jacob goes and he finds a place and he has this dream where angels are going up and down on this ladder, showing that this is a point that connects the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. He builds an altar there. So what is John saying? Jesus is the connecting link between the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. He is this ladder that angels will go up and down upon. Or John the Baptist, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." If you know anything about Judaism, you know that the notion of taking away sin is especially associated with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And what John has done is to take in this imagery of Yom Kippur and imported it into John the Baptist's testimony. Now, I'm not commenting at all upon whether any of this is or is not historical. What I'm looking at is how John has put this gospel together to tell the story that he wants to tell. Jesus, as it turns out, is going to be the real meaning of Yom Kippur, because Jesus is going to be this sacrificial lamb. If you look at the crucifixion in John's gospel, John and the Synoptic Gospels differ, and I'm sure many of you know this. The Synoptic Gospels have Jesus, die on Good Friday, but it's the first day of Passover. It's the first day of Passover. The day begins in the evening with sunset and goes on to the next day. So he has this Passover meal, the institution of the Eucharist. He dies the next day. In John's Gospel, it's a day earlier. It's still Friday, but it's a day earlier. It's called the Day of Preparation. And what happens on the Day of Preparation? This is when the Passover lambs are sacrificed in the temple. And so at the same time that Jesus is being put to death as a sacrifice, you have John the Baptist saying, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world." And so Jesus is also the meaning of Passover, but again, what John is doing is combining these traditions, because Passover has nothing to do with forgiveness of sins. Passover has to do with freedom, the freeing of the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt. But John takes these images and kind of recombines them in light of his experience, in light of the Christian faith that is developing. And I would actually argue that's what we're always doing. We're always making sense of the faith tradition that we inherit in light of the various experiences that we have, which is why it becomes crucial, but also difficult, to make sense of something like John 8:44, the Jews are children of the devil, in light of the belief that has emerged that, we don't really believe that. We don't believe that the Jews are children of the devil. And so what do we do with our scriptures when they say that the Jews are the children of the devil? So Yom Kippur, Passover in John 6, Jesus feeds 5,000 people, and he says that he is the bread of life, come down from heaven. And so Jesus is the true meaning of Passover as well. In chapters 7 and 8, we have the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths, also known as Sukkot, which is a fall harvest festival, and it's a pilgrimage festival. And Jesus, in that context, says that he's the light of the world. And one of the rites for this festival was to go around the temple with these big torches, because you're thanking God for the things you need to grow crops, light, water. And so Jesus makes appeals to these elements in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we find that the early Christians are taking over the Jewish festivals and reinterpreting them, reinscribing them in light of their convictions about Jesus as the Messiah. He's the true meaning behind these festivals. He's also the true meaning in Scripture. There are 18 citations from the Jewish Scriptures, depending upon how one counts, in the Gospel of John. And just as an example, I've put down John 5, and this is not a quotation, but it's a reference to Scripture. You search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and yet it is they that testify on my behalf. So this early Christian conviction that the Scriptures bear witness to the identity of Jesus. One of the things that happened in early Christianity was, more mystery coming your way here. If you read Scripture from a Jewish perspective, then you know what to look for in a Messiah. And here we go. It looks something like this. Yeah, that's Hebrew. Let's turn it around. There we go. That's better. If you're Jewish and you read the Scriptures, you know what the Messiah is supposed to look like. The Messiah is supposed to kind of be a King David figure who's going to be a warrior figure, but also somebody who is going to restore proper worship in the temple. At the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believed that there was going to be a royal Messiah who would be a warrior. They believed there was going to be a priestly Messiah who would be somebody who would restore worship. And they disagreed with the way that temple worship was conducted. But what if you have come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah? But he's not the kind of Messiah you were looking for. Because dying, rising Messiah? Not so much. And in fact, there's this great passage in Luke 24. This is the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, where Jesus appears to these disciples, and he comes up alongside of them, the risen Jesus. They don't recognize him. He says, "So, what are you talking about?" And they say, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened here?" And he says, "Well, what are you talking about?" And they say, "About Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet, mighty in word and deed, and how our chief priests and elders handed him over to be put to death. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." This is the only glimpse we get of what the followers of Jesus are thinking after the death, before they come to believe in the resurrection. We had hope. Do they hope any longer? No. Why? He's dead. Why do women go to the tomb? To anoint a body. What are they expecting to find? A body. They're not expecting a resurrected Jesus. And so they come to believe, however, that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And so now the first thing they do is to try to make sense of their experience in light of their scriptures. So they've come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So now they go back and they reread Scripture, and they see things that they didn't see before. For example, under the Jewish Scripture here at the bottom of the page, the story of the beloved disciple who runs with Peter to the tomb. And the beloved disciple goes in and he believes, even without seeing the risen Jesus. Peter apparently doesn't believe yet. And then we're told in this little editorial note, as yet they did not know the Scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Namely, they hadn't reinterpreted Scripture yet in light of this understanding. And so these are all called Christological readings of the Jewish Scriptures. And this is something about which Jews and Christians obviously disagree tremendously. So if you turn over, you with me so far? Good. All right. Well, this is where I plan to lose you. So, about a long time ago, in a land far, far away, New York City actually, there were two scholars, one guy, a very prominent Roman Catholic scholar named Raymond Brown, another guy named Lou Martin, and they both taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York, kind of an interdenominational, non-denominational Protestant seminary. And both of them were working on the Gospel of John. Ray Brown had written this magisterial 2-volume commentary in the 1960s on the Gospel of John. Lou Martin also did a couple of very significant books. But in the late 70s, 1978, Ray Brown came out with a book called The Community of the Beloved Disciple. And this was at a time when people were really trying to figure out, all right, these Gospels are written for somebody. Who were they written for? And so people started theorizing about the communities behind the Gospels. And Ray Brown came out with this book, and it was a real milestone in the study of the Gospel of John. And even though there are many people who have significant doubts about it, it's a very interesting way of looking at why John appears the way it does now. Because one of the things we have to remember, again, is that when John, in fact I would say this, when all of the evangelists are writing, none of them think of themselves as writing scripture. They all think they are writing a sacred story, for sure. But this is a story that gets revised along with the experiences of the community. And what we can see are tensions in the gospel, literary seams sometimes in the gospel, that gives us a clue about the composition history. And so we're going to start with what's called the signs source. And this is the theory, that originally John's gospel, and here I have another really just swell illustration for you. Isn't that just beyond exciting? What in the world is it, they wonder? Well, believe it or not, this is the Jewish world in the first century. Ta-da! And the things in the middle are various groups. Josephus, for example, tells us that there are various sects or various groups within Judaism. So he tells us about the Pharisees, we learn about the Sadducees. And both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, of course, are mentioned in the New Testament. We also learn about the Zealots, and we learn about the Essenes, these different Jewish groups who have slightly different emphases, sometimes radically different emphases. The Sadducees, for example, did not believe in life after death. The Pharisees did. The Sadducees did not believe in what came to be called the oral law. The Pharisees did. And so you have different Jewish groups arguing about what it really means to be Jewish. And on the scene comes, we'll add this little group right over here. Where are they? Yes, this, no, not them. Where are they? This is so disorienting. Here we go. This group right there. See, right there. A little group. And this group we would call Christian Jews. These are Jews who have come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And what do they want to do? Well, they want to share this news with other Jews in the synagogue. And so, look at this passage from John 20. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. So there's a reference to a book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. That's a very interesting statement. Why are these signs written? That you might come to believe, that you might begin to believe. Now there's a very interesting textual variant here, because some manuscripts read that you might begin to believe, other manuscripts read that you might continue to believe. And that's quite a difference. So who is it written for if it's that you might come to believe? It's written for people who don't yet believe. And so this makes this group kind of an evangelical missionary group trying to spread this word about Jesus the Messiah. And look at these amazing signs that he did, and surely you'll come to believe. Eventually, these signs were rejected. The testimony of these Christian Jews was rejected. And so, eventually, this got revised. So it's not that you might come to believe, rather that you might continue to believe. Because now this is a group for insiders, people who already believe. But we're not quite there yet. So, this first edition of, actually not the first edition, the sign source, leads to something that some people call sign faith. And you have this nice little thing in the Gospel of John, where at the end of chapter 20 you have this statement, these signs are written that you might have faith, you might come to believe. And then, remember the story of the changing of the water into wine, chapter 2 of John. Well, that story, at the end of it, in 2:11, it says, and the disciples believed in him on the basis of the signs. And then in chapter 4, verse 54, we have the story of the Capernaum official. He and his whole household come to believe on the basis of a sign. And so they see a sign, they come to believe. And then the story of the doubting Thomas. Remember in chapter 20? Thomas isn't there when the risen Jesus shows up, and Thomas says, I'm not going to believe unless I see, touch, feel. Basically, what is he saying? I need a sign. I need proof. All these people are from Missouri, you know. They need a sign in order to believe. Missouri's a show-me state, in case you're wondering what that connection was. It still doesn't make any sense, does it? Okay. So, at any rate, this first stage is this evangelical stage of this community, trying to spread this word about Jesus. They spread this word, some people believe, but ultimately, it doesn't work. And so then you have a revision of the sign source, because a couple of things happen. Two things in particular. First, we're told in chapter 12 of John's Gospel that even though he had performed so many signs in their presence, yet they did not believe. And so, here's the question. Is this something that's taking place at the narrative level of Jesus' ministry, or is this a reflection of what's going on during the lifetime of this community that's reflecting upon this gospel? And what many people believe and argue is that this is reflecting something going on perhaps in the 80s or the 90s of the first century. So a generation or two after Jesus, as these people have tried to spread this word in the synagogue, but it's been rejected. It's been rejected. A second thing has happened as well. And the second thing that has happened is the expulsion from the synagogue. And there's a lot of debate about this expulsion from the synagogue. But you have this 3 times in the Gospel of John. Here in chapter 9:22, again in chapter 12:42, and then again in chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. But it's a really interesting thing, and it's a larger story. It's a story of the man born blind in John 9. And in this story, if you imagine it as a series of kind of theatrical scenes, I think it works very well. Because the first scene is this man born blind is there, and the disciples want to know, all right, who sinned? This guy or his parents that he was born blind? They know somebody sinned somewhere. Either these are the sins of the parents being visited upon the child, or God foreknew that this guy was going to be lousy, no good, and so he's kind of cursed him with blindness in advance. And Jesus says, it's not that anybody sinned, rather it's so that the works of God might be made manifest. And so this is an opportunity now for a sign. So Jesus heals him, tells him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent, very important for John. And then Jesus is off stage. He simply goes off stage. Next, we have the neighbors. Hey, weren't you the guy who was blind? No, I don't think so. Was he? Yeah, I think he was. And he says, yeah, I'm the guy. Well, who healed you? Some guy named Jesus. Where is he? Beats me. And then they bring him to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees say, what happened with all this? And he explained it to them. And they ask him, so what do you think about this guy? I think he's a prophet. And so what you notice is a deepening of this man's faith. He starts, a man called Jesus, now he's a prophet. And now the Pharisees aren't quite so sure about this, so they call in the guy's parents. And the parents are wonderful. The epitome of what you don't want in paternal affection here. The Pharisees ask the parents, all right, is this your son? Was he born blind? How does he see now? And they say, yep, he's our son. Yes, he was born blind. It beats us how he sees now. Ask him. He's old enough. He can take care of it himself. We have nothing to do with this. Ask him. Why? Because the Jews had already agreed that anybody who would confess Jesus to be the Messiah or the Christ would be kicked out of the synagogue. And so now we ask an historical question. At what point in the relationship between Judaism and emerging Christianity did Jews kick Christians out of the synagogue? If you take it at face value, it looks like during Jesus' public ministry. But that's highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. Because you have a variety of Jewish groups, and they put up with each other, even though they have significant disagreements with each other. And so what many people argue is that you have these expulsions from the synagogue only after Christians come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So only after these Christian Jews, they come to believe that he's died, he's been raised from the dead, and they're preaching this now in the synagogue. But as we already know from chapter 12, this isn't going over very well. They reject the testimony, they reject these Christians, and so they get kicked out. And so they now become Jewish Christians. No longer Christian Jews, they become Jewish Christians. So you have a rejection of the signs, you have expulsion from the synagogue, and then you have something else that takes place internal to the Christian community. And it's a debate about the value of faith based on signs. So here's the question. Is the faith that Thomas has on the basis of signs, because when Jesus shows up, what does Thomas say? My Lord and my God. I've often thought, what choice did he have? Jesus shows up, touch, see, feel, my Lord and my God. But then what does Jesus say? Blessed is the one who believes without seeing. And so rather than seeing lead to believing, ideally for John, believing leads to seeing in new ways. This is a nice little inversion that takes place in John's gospel. And so this is an implicit criticism of faith based on signs. And in chapter 2, you have the same thing. Many people came and believed in his signs, believed in him because of the signs, but Jesus would not trust himself to them because he knew all people and he knew what was in people. So you have this suspicion of faith that is based on signs. There's a deeper faith that is called for. And the man born blind, for example, illustrates this faith. He goes from Jesus to a prophet to saying that Jesus is a man from God, and the Pharisees kick him out of the synagogue. They say, we're disciples of Moses, you're his disciple. And he says, hey, all I know is that once I was blind, now I see. Seems to come from God. And then Jesus shows up at the end of the story. You believe in the Son of Man. Who is he that I might believe in him? And Jesus says, I am. I mean, you hear that, you have to think, I am, I am, I am, I am. This nice little echo of the divine name from the burning bush story. And so you have this deepening of faith told in this story. You can see the same thing going on in the Samaritan woman, where her faith deepens as the story progresses. But in terms of what we're talking about today, again, this is a living community, and this is a living document that changes to reflect what's going on within the community. So that's what some people would call the first edition of John. Namely, it adopts the sign source, reframes it in certain ways, acknowledges a certain critique of faith based on signs, recognizes that this testimony on the basis of signs basically has not worked as they had thought it would within the synagogue. And so now you have this split between Christian Jews, who have now become Jewish Christians. They've left, they've been kicked out, and so they're on their own. Incredible animosity now between these Jewish Christians and the synagogue. This then leads to a discussion of the second edition of John. By the way, is everybody still with me? Is this making a certain amount of sense? I'll settle for a certain amount. Okay, good. All right. So now we're led to the second edition of John. And why do I say second edition? It's because there appear to be a couple of literary seams. And what I mean by that is you can see where there's been some cutting and pasting. And again, from the perspective of the gospel writer, this isn't scripture. This is something that reveals the faith of the community towards the end of the first century. And so they adapt the scripture in light of their experience. And what is their experience? Well, a couple of things. The first thing that happens is that they move from expulsion, merely being expelled, now they're being persecuted. And so in chapter 16, Jesus says, the days are coming when they will kick you out of the synagogue. And not only that, basically, they will hunt you down and they will kill you, thinking that they are doing God's service. So now we have the threat of martyrdom, which is significantly greater than being kicked out of the synagogue. It's something significant to go from expulsion now to persecution. And that takes place in chapter 16, 1 through 4. Well, in light of that, take a look, if you will, at what's underneath here. John 14, 30 to 15:2, and John 14, 30 and 31, / John 18, 1. Is there somebody who's game to read this real loud? Real loud? Okay. So if you'll take John 14, 30 to 15:2, and somebody game to take the other one? Please, if you'll take John 14, 30 and 31, and then it cuts right to 18:1. Okay, so we're reading these two versions. I don't know if you want to stand up and shout.
I will no longer talk much with you, for the ruler of this world is coming. He has no power over me, but I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. Rise, let us be on our way. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit.
There we go. Version number 2.
I will no longer talk much with you, for the ruler of this world is coming. He has no power over me, but I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. Rise, let us be on our way. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered.
Okay. Which way reads more smoothly in your view? The first way. Interesting. How come?
I just feel like, I don't know, I just feel like it, I don't know, it just flows smoother for me just to hear I feel like it's all in one cadence, like the other one kind of breaks up after when it says, like, after Jesus had spoken these words, it kind of seems like
Okay.
Jesus was talking.
Any other takers, please?
I'd say the second one reads more smoothly.
Why?
Mainly because it says, rise, let's be on our way, and then it says they all got up and left.
Okay. Yeah, and he says, I'm not going to talk with you much longer. Rise, let us be on our way. And then he speaks for 3 more chapters. And you're kind of going, wait a minute. Now, it's entirely possible that the first way is the correct way. But what some scholars say is, you know what, it looks like there's what we would call a literary seam here, where somebody has inserted chapters 15, 16, and 17. Now, when I say somebody has inserted, I'm not talking about 400 years later. We're talking about within the lifetime of the author or his followers of the Gospel of John. And that it reflects a slight shift in what's taking place. And so what's the shift? Well, if you look at chapters 13 through 17, this is known as the last discourse of John. 13 and 14 are seen as the first discourse. 15 through 17 is called the second discourse. This all takes place on the night Jesus is betrayed. And what is the content of the last discourse? Well, the first discourse, the content goes something like this. I'm not going to be around much longer. I have to go away. I'm going into the heavenly realm. But it's going to be okay. I'm going to send the Spirit. It's going to be all right. You're going to have some rough times, but it's going to be okay. I have to go. And the disciples say, where are you going? We don't know where you're going. And he says, it's going to be all right. I'm going to send the Spirit. It's going to be okay. Fair enough. What do you have in 15 through 17? I really got to go. I can't stay. The Spirit's going to come. You're going to have some really difficult times. Not only are they going to kick you out, they're going to try and kill you. It's going to be very difficult, but I'm going to pray to the Father that the Father might watch out for you in chapter 17 and watch out for you and those who come after you. It's going to be very difficult, but I have to go, and I'm going to go. And so basically you have a repetition that's much more intense in chapters 15 through 17 from what we see in 13 and 14. This also adds to the conviction of some people that this is slightly later material. Again, by slightly, we talking 5 years, 10 years, a month and a half, hard to say. But it does capture this shift from expulsion to persecution. So things have intensified. And then there's one other problem, one other issue that has come up. And this has to do with the death of the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple is the hero of the Gospel of John, aside from Jesus. And the beloved disciple only shows up in the second half of the Gospel. The first time he shows up is in chapter 13 at the Last Supper. And it's this amazing scene where you have Jesus, the beloved disciple, and Peter. Jesus says, someone's going to betray me. Peter turns to the beloved disciple and says, hey, ask who he's talking about. And so so the beloved disciple asks, and Jesus says, but the beloved disciple acts as the intermediary between Peter and Jesus. And you kind of think, well, couldn't Peter just have gone, Jesus, who are you talking about? But no, he goes through the beloved disciple. The next time the beloved disciple shows up is in chapter 19, the crucifixion. He's the only disciple to show up at the crucifixion. He's the only disciple who is faithful all the way through. And on the cross, Jesus sees his mother, he sees the beloved disciple, he says, woman, behold your son. Perhaps talking about himself, perhaps talking about the beloved disciple. And he says to the disciple, son, behold your mother. And from that hour, the beloved disciple took Mary into his own home. So clearly he's kind of taking over the leadership role. And then in chapter 20, you have the beloved disciple and Peter running to the tomb. And it's a great story because the beloved disciple gets there first. He outruns Peter. Not that there's any symbolism there whatsoever. Until you get to a little bit later in the passage where it says, and then the beloved disciple who reached the tomb first, in case you forgot this from 4 verses ago, he went in and he believed. He believes before Peter believes. He gets it. But now, in chapter 21, I mean. In chapter 21, first of all, something you have to know about chapter 21. The style of chapter 21 is rather different than the style of the rest of the gospel. And the end of chapter 20, there are many other signs that Jesus did that are not written in this book. These are written that you might believe. Sounds like the end. But then at the end of chapter 21, you have, and there are many other things that Jesus did, and were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself couldn't contain all those books. So it looks like the end, part 2. So what's going on in chapter 21? Well, what's going on in chapter 21 is, once again, the beloved disciple shows up. He shows Peter that it's Jesus over here, because Peter doesn't realize it until the beloved disciple says so. But then at the very end of the chapter, you have this funny little dialogue between Jesus and Peter. Peter turns and he sees the beloved disciple following him. And he says to Jesus, what about this guy? And Jesus says, hey, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what's that to you? Follow me. And so the saying developed that that disciple wasn't going to die before Jesus returned. And then the author says, but Jesus did not say he wasn't going to die. He just said, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what's that to you? Now, the only reason you have to say Jesus didn't say he wasn't going to die is because he died. And so you have the leader of this community dying. They don't expect him to die before Jesus comes back. And so there's an increase in persecution. Their leader is dead. All hell is breaking loose, basically, for this community. And that's kind of where we leave them. Now, what does this have to do with Jewish-Christian relations? Well, a lot. If you understand the context out of which the Gospel of John grows, then you understand that this is a Jewish world using Jewish symbols to fight about what God is up to fight about the identity of Jesus in an kind of Jewish debate. There's a big fight that goes on among scholars about the degree to which this is an intramural fight or an extramural fight. Is this something that is taking place within the synagogue or outside of the synagogue? And what you can say, I think, is that in the Gospel of John, what we're seeing are two rival groups of Jews. One group who believes that Jesus is the Messiah and is reinterpreting all of their tradition to that end. And another group who are convinced that Jesus is not the Messiah, and they're at loggerheads with each other. So what does it mean in the 21st century to reread the Gospel of John, to reread that the Jews are children of the devil? Well, it means a couple of things. First of all, it means that we have to recognize that this gospel has been interpreted in a virtually exclusively Gentile Christian world from the 2nd century on. It's been interpreted by people who don't know the Jewish scriptures as well as they did in the 1st century. And so this language of the Jews being children of the devil, I think it's very important to defang it in many respects, to understand where it comes from and why it comes in that way. But just because it's there doesn't mean that we have to continue to say that the Jews are children of the devil. And if you look at the the interreligious movement of dialogue, in 1965, the Roman Catholic Church came out with something called Nostra Aetate, in our times, which was the first major statement that was inclusive of Judaism in some regards. It recognized that the Jews are not responsible for the death of Jesus, the Romans are. It recognized that the Jewish tradition has a series of promises and a covenant relationship with God. And that tradition has continued to such a degree that when the Pope went to the synagogue in Rome, he talked about the Jews as elder brethren of Christians. And so here's the theological dilemma. Jews do not have to deal theologically with Christians. They have to deal socially, politically, historically, but a Jew can simply say, you know what, these Christians have kind of gone off the deep end about this whole Jesus thing, and I wish they would just leave us alone. Christians have no choice but to deal with Judaism theologically, because Christians claim a set of scriptures that the Jews also claim. Christians claim that these scriptures point to the coming of a Messiah, and Christians interpret these Jewish scriptures, Christian scriptures, in light of this conviction about Jesus as the Messiah. So we have no choice. And so we can choose to be supersessionist, which was a choice made very often. We can choose something that's called a dual covenant approach, which is to say, you know what, it's a mystery, but apparently God has two covenants, one for the Jews, one for the Gentiles. Or we can do what Paul did in Romans 9 through 11 and say, well, you know what? It's a mystery. God makes good on his promises to Israel, even if we don't understand it, the Jewish people, even if we don't understand it. And just to put it really sharply, in light of the recent election, this is perhaps too sharp, but there we go. I sometimes think, if you want to know what Jews in the 2nd century thought about Christians, all you have to do is to look at what Christians today think about Mormons. Because there's a new revealer figure, there's a new set of scriptures, there's a claim to fulfill and supersede the tradition. And many Christians look at Mormons and say, well, they seem like nice people, but they believe some really weird things. And I think many of the Jews in the 2nd century had kind of the same attitude. Now, does this solve the problem of Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish-Christian dialogue? No. But it does address and help to contextualize an aspect of reading Scripture so that we have to be aware of the context in which these writings come about. And if we're aware of those contexts, it can really help in understanding why this is what it says. So that's my spiel, and I'd welcome any comments or reflections. You have 5.5 minutes.
Are there any questions? Come on, there has to be some questions.
Did it make sense, what I'm saying? Okay. You may not buy it, but go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess when I was reading, I was studying, like, I think in the past century, a lot of theologians, like Christian theologians, think that for Christian understanding, it's really important, like, how you reconcile, I read somewhere, like, one of the theologians, I can't remember his name, but he was saying that, in a sense, the Christian community can't be fully effective or what they're supposed to be until they, like, reconcile their relationship with the Jewish roots or Jewish community.
Yes.
What do you think are, like, implications of that reconciliation between the Christian community now and, like, their Jewish roots they have and the Jewish community
Well,
now?
I mean, one of the earliest Christian heresies was called Marcionism. The belief that there was a God of the Old Testament who was a mean, nasty, angry God, and there's a God of the New Testament who was a God of love. I'm glad that's a heresy, because the God of the Jewish Scriptures is the same as the God of Jesus. And so affirming that connection is one thing that's very important. Also, I mean, Christians don't know Jewish Scriptures very well at all. They don't know the Old Testament. And so I think it becomes incumbent upon us to become much more familiar with what for Jesus was his Bible. So I think it's very important. Part of the question is, what does it mean to have reconciliation for Jews? That's part of the debate. Yes?
When you're reading this,
Real loud.
when you're reading this scripture, it talks about the Jews in John 8. Why are we to believe that it's talking about all the Jews rather than the Jews that he's speaking to?
Well, there's a debate actually among scholars. Is this just talking about the Jewish leaders who helped to bring Jesus before Pilate, or is it talking about all Jews? And it's a fair debate. Suffice it to say that within Christian history, that distinction hasn't been made. Within the Christian history of interpretation, that has been seen as a blanket condemnation of all Jews. And if you look at, for example, at medieval art, and you look at churches with, the symbol of the church is this woman with a crown. The symbol of Israel is a blindfolded woman with a broken staff. And Augustine talked about the Jews as witnesses to the terrible things that can happen to you if you fail to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Justin Martyr, my favorite, 2nd century. Why did the Jews get circumcised? So that God would know who to punish for killing the Messiah. That's the mark that they get, so God knows who to punish. Yes, anything else? Well, I would encourage you to think about, and perhaps you haven't thought about it a lot, what does it mean to be a Christian in relationship to Judaism? It's not an easy task, but I encourage you to think about it. So there you go.
Thank you.